Gray Files. Case 1. It's funny how the desert can make you feel small. You'd think it would be the wide open spaces that make you feel free. But out here, all you get is a sense of how insignificant you really are. Just a speck in the dirt, blown away by the wind. The government gave me this job. Assignments like this one, the kind I've been on for years now. It's not a glamorous gig, nothing flashy. It's all the things that never make the headlines, the cases that get shuffled off to the back corners. But the thing is, you can only keep ignoring the oddities for so long before they start to pile up. I've seen the reports, the declassified documents, and the files that came with my name on them. For years, I thought UFOs and aliens were nothing more than wild speculation, nothing more than a byproduct of too much moonshine and too little sense. Then came the call, the kind of call that changes everything. I'm on my way to rural New Mexico now, sitting behind the wheel of a government-issued sedan, staring out at a landscape that's as desolate as my last good idea. The air smells of dust and heat, and the wind has kicked up, swirling dirt across the road like a veil that never seems to settle. The sun is dipping low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of orange and purple. It feels like the end of the world out here, but it's just another Tuesday. The reports weren't much to go on. A UFO crash, they said, in a remote part of the state. Witnesses, local farmers and ranchers who'd seen a streak of fire in the sky, too fast to be anything they recognized. The government dismissed it right off the bat. Another weather balloon, a military test gone wrong, the usual cover-ups. But there was something in the locals' voices when they called. Fear. Real fear. You could hear it in their words, even if they weren't saying anything at all. I was sent here to find out what was really going on, or at least to make it go away. The reports say the UFO came down in a fireball, crashing into the earth in a blaze of light, the kind of thing you only see in a movie. But the more I listened to the witnesses, the more it didn't add up. Something about the whole thing felt off. And the missing people? That wasn't in the file. I flicked the cigarette butt out the window and watched it disappear into the dust. Maybe I'd find the answers I was looking for, or maybe it would just be another story to add to the pile. Either way, I had a job to do, and the desert was waiting. The government sedan came to a slow stop, kicking up a plume of dust as it slid to the side of the road. I looked out the window and took in the scene. There was nothing glamorous about this place, just endless, flat desert, dotted with a few scrubby bushes and jagged mesas in the distance. The crash site, or what was left of it, was about a mile off the main road, tucked between two mesas like an unwelcomed guest hiding in plain sight. A small farmhouse sat a little farther down the dirt track. It looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in years, its shutters hanging askew, and its roof sagging in places. This was where the first witnesses had reported seeing the UFO fall. But now, all that was here was a sterile perimeter. Military personnel stood in a cordoned-off area, their figures stiff and formal, but they weren't doing much beyond keeping the curious away. The military's usual cover-up routine, I thought, but when I looked closer, my stomach twisted. There was no wreckage. No charred remains of an alien ship, just a few faint scorch marks in the sand. Nothing to suggest anything out of the ordinary had happened. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the dry earth. The wind hit me in the face, carrying the smell of metal and dust. I pulled the collar of my coat higher and walked toward the small group gathered near the farmhouse. A couple of farmers stood with their hands on their hips, watching me approach. But it wasn't them I was here for. It was the two witnesses, the ones who had reported the incident, and both of them were standing off to the side, avoiding the military presence as best they could. I walked over to Sarah Dawes first. She looked the part of a rancher, a woman in her late 40s with weathered skin from years of exposure to the sun. She had a strong, no-nonsense air about her, but her eyes betrayed her, wide and nervous, darting around as if she were expecting someone to jump out from behind the hills. "Agent Grayson," she said with a shaky voice, offering her hand. She didn't look me in the eye. "Ma'am," I said, shaking her hand, but her grip was weak. "Tell me what you saw." She glanced over at Jim Harrow, a thin, wiry man with a sunken face, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as if holding himself together. He looked more nervous than she did, but that was saying something. They'd both been through the ringer, I could tell. "Well," Sarah started, swallowing hard. "It was late afternoon, almost sundown. We were out by the western fields just finishing up the day's work when we saw it. This thing, this light, it just shot across the sky like a fireball, all glowing metal and flames. It crashed behind that mesa over there." She pointed toward the ridge in the distance, her finger trembling. We heard it too. A loud sound, almost like a humming, then a big explosion. But we were too scared to get close, Agent. Too damn scared. Jim finally spoke, his voice raspy, like he hadn't used it much in the last few hours. "It wasn't no plane. Ain't no way. It was like nothing I ever saw before. Glowed real bright like it was burning in the sky. I'm telling you, it wasn't no damn weather balloon." "I understand," I said, nodding slowly. I knew what they were saying, but it was hard to take it at face value. After all, they weren't trained observers. "But why didn't you go check the wreckage?" Neither of them answered immediately, and when they did, their eyes didn't meet mine. We heard noises," Jim said, his voice trembling. "Strange sounds like someone was out there. Voices maybe. But we couldn't get too close. We were scared." I studied them for a long moment, both of them standing in the hot desert sun, their eyes shifting uneasily between the crash site and the cordon. They weren't acting like hoaxers, but their story was shaky. The fear in their voices was real, but their confusion made me question their credibility. "What kind of noises?" I asked, trying to get more specifics. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, then looked me straight in the eyes. "I don't know how to explain it. It was like a hum, a low hum followed by something else, like metal scraping against metal. We couldn't see anyone, just shadows moving in the distance." I nodded, taking note. Whatever this was, it wasn't your typical UFO story, but it wasn't much to go on either. I could feel my skepticism creeping in, but I pushed it down. I'd been doing this long enough to know that first impressions were often wrong. Still, something about this didn't sit right. Maybe it was the military presence, or the lack of any substantial wreckage, or maybe it was just the way they kept glancing over their shoulders, like they were expecting something, or someone, to come out of the desert. I stepped away from the witnesses and pulled out my notebook, taking down the details. But the more I wrote, the more my gut told me this could be a hoax, an accident covered up by the government. It wasn't unheard of for military tests to go awry, for planes or missiles to crash, and for the government to sweep it under the rug. I sent off an initial report to Director Henry Calloway, my superior, outlining the facts as I knew them. There was no evidence to substantiate the claims yet, but the witnesses seemed genuine, and the location was unusual. For now, I had to play it by the book. I noted that the case was unsubstantiated but worthy of further investigation. The wind picked up again, swirling dust around my feet as I sent the report through the encrypted channel. As I turned back toward the witnesses, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something much bigger than a simple hoax. But for now, all I had were scorch marks in the sand. The desert was a vast, unyielding place, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence pressed in from all sides. The winds had died down, leaving behind only the occasional rustle of sand shifting across the barren land. I could feel the stillness in my bones. Something about the desert at night made you think too much, made you feel too much. Every rustle, every gust of wind felt like a whisper, like a presence waiting just out of sight. I'd planned to stay overnight, hoping the quiet hours would give me a clearer picture of what was going on. There was a motel about 20 miles away, but I didn't trust the place. Something about the lights flickering in the distance felt wrong. So, I parked my car near the farmhouse, far enough from the military cordon to remain unnoticed, but close enough to see if anything unusual happened overnight. I lit a cigarette and leaned against the hood of the car, watching the sky turn to ink above me. As the stars flickered to life, I found myself thinking about the reports, the witnesses, and what exactly had crashed here in the desert. That's when I saw him. A man in his late 40s, tall and built like he spent more time lifting weights than walking a beat. Franklin Russo, my cynical FBI partner. He hadn't been keen on the idea of investigating UFOs, but when orders came down from above, he had to tag along. Russo had a reputation for dismissing things he couldn't explain, and UFOs fell squarely into that category. Still standing out here, huh? Russo's voice cut through the silence, gruff and heavy with the weight of someone who didn't sleep much. He stepped into the dim light, his eyes squinting against the fading sun. "You're gonna catch a cold out here, Grayson." "And for what? A few scorch marks and a couple of hysterical ranchers?" I exhaled a thin stream of smoke, not looking at him. "You can head back to the motel if you want. I'm staying out here. Might get something more from the locals tomorrow." He snorted. "Locals. I'm sure they'll have all the answers we need," he muttered. But it was clear he was staying. "This is gonna be a long few days, Grayson. You know that, right?" "I know," I said, flicking the ash from my cigarette. "But I have a feeling something's off about all this. I'll take the weirdness over the red tape any day." Russo shook his head, walking over to the car and leaning on it beside me. "Fine. But when this turns out to be just a weather balloon or some drunk in a Cessna, don't say I didn't warn you." We were quiet for a moment, listening to the nothingness of the desert. Then, Russo spoke again, his voice more serious. "I've been reading up on UFO sightings across the country. Whole damn thing reeks of mass hysteria. The public's been conditioned to look for something extraordinary, so when something strange happens, they're quick to slap a UFO label on it. No proof, no credibility." I exhaled again, staring into the darkness. "Maybe, but those farmers, their fear wasn't manufactured. It was real." Russo laughed, though it was more a sharp bark than a genuine chuckle. "You're a believer now, Grayson? You'll fit right in with the X-Files crowd." "I'm not sure what I believe," I replied, my eyes still scanning the night. "But there's something about this that doesn't feel right. I can't shake it." We fell into silence, and for a while nothing disturbed the stillness of the desert, except for the distant howl of the wind. The heat of the desert seemed endless, the sun beating down as I arrived at Jim Harrow's farm. His truck was there, parked in the middle of the dirt road, keys still in the ignition. But Jim was nowhere to be found. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away. The place felt wrong. It had been hours since anyone had seen him. I walked around the truck, my boots crunching in the dry dirt, my mind racing. "This is exactly like Sarah's," I muttered under my breath. Russo was already checking the perimeter, his expression a mix of suspicion and irritation. "We're wasting our time," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "There's nothing here. No body, no blood, not even a footprint, just like last time." "Look again," I snapped, feeling the weight of something I couldn't explain but knew was there. "We're missing something." We scoured the area for hours, combing through the scrub brush, the shallow ravines, the distant foothills. But there was nothing. Not a single clue that pointed us toward Jim. It was like the desert had swallowed him whole. Rumors had started circulating among the townspeople. Whispers in the darkened corners of bars and diners. Lights in the sky. Things that walk among us. The locals were scared, and they had good reason. Every person who had seen something, heard something, had disappeared, one by one. I couldn't shake the feeling that something far larger was at play, something that had been hidden for years, if not decades. The deeper I dug, the more questions I had. I started going through the records of the initial UFO report, trying to connect the dots. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon the gray files hidden in the back of a dusty cabinet in the local archives. These files were heavily redacted, almost unreadable in parts, but the names, locations, and events mentioned stood out. Something was off. The further I read, the clearer it became. The incident in the desert wasn't an isolated event. There were references to similar crashes, other crashes, scattered across the country. But what made these files so unsettling wasn't the events they described. It was the obvious attempts to hide the true nature of what had happened. Everything had been covered up. The names were crossed out, dates erased. Even the nature of the objects involved was unclear. But the term gray kept appearing over and over again. Who or what were these people or entities? The files suggested a pattern, a connection between the UFOs and something far more covert. There were whispers of experiments, covert operations, and something that had been happening for far longer than anyone realized. I had to know more, but there was one problem. The files were classified, way beyond my clearance level. Whoever was behind this was doing everything they could to keep it hidden. It was late one evening when I saw it, a flash of light, bright enough to cut through the darkness of the desert sky. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make my heart race. The light didn't behave like anything natural, too controlled, too precise. It wasn't a meteor. It wasn't lightning. It was something deliberate. I stood there, staring up at the sky, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was watching me. I could feel it. Something, or someone, was observing from above. I snapped a photo on my phone, but by the time I reviewed it, the flash was gone. All I could see was the night sky, empty, no signs of any unusual light. Had I imagined it? I knew what I saw, but it didn't matter. I was already being watched. There was no going back from this. The following day, Director Calloway showed up at the ranch. I didn't expect him, and certainly not like this. He arrived with a small team of men in dark suits, all of them walking with that unmistakable air of authority, like they owned the place. "Grayson," he greeted me with an icy smile. "I see you've made some progress." He wasn't here to praise me. He was here to shut it down. Calloway glanced over the scene. Sarah and Jim's missing persons cases, the scorch marks, the increasingly strange reports from the locals, and his expression never wavered. "It's coincidence," he said firmly. "A couple of people went missing. A few lights in the sky. Nothing we can't explain." I wasn't buying it. "Director, there's something going on here. These disappearances, they're connected to what's out there. The gray files." I was cut off as Calloway raised a hand. "I'll take those." I handed over the gray files, but as soon as the papers left my hands, I knew I had lost something far more important than just the documents. He'd taken the only lead I had. "Close the case, Grayson," Calloway said, his voice cold. "It's over. You've done enough." His words echoed in my mind long after he left, leaving me with an unsettling feeling deep in my gut. I had a sinking suspicion. This was just the beginning. Calloway's dismissal wasn't the end. It was the start of something darker.